On April 17th, 1861, a broadside was posted around town with this message: "War, war, war." The free men of Old Concord will meet at the town hall on Friday evening, April 19th at 7:30 to make measures to fill up the ranks and strengthen the arms of the Concord Artillery Company, that they may go forth to fight our country's battles as our fathers did in 1775. Come one, come all, from the farm and the workshop, the counting room and the office, and show by our action that we are not degenerate sons of brave sires. Welcome to Concord Days. We're having conversations about Concord, Massachusetts. My name is Tammy Rose. I'm a playwright historian, and today I have with me Richard Smith. Richard, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Richard Smith. I'm a Concord historian and writer, and have been involved in telling the stories of Concord history for 21 years, since 1999. And I've had some books published about people like Henry David Thoreau, and I've worked at most of the historic sites in town. And today we're going to talk about something that doesn't get covered very much in Concord. You know, if you come to Concord, it's all about the Revolutionary War and it's all about transcendentalists. But one of the things that we don't really cover very much to my chagrin, is the Civil War. Which is kind of hard to miss, because in the middle of Concord, in Monument Square, is a huge 42-foot monument dedicated to the men who died in the Civil War from Concord, Massachusetts.
And so, is that the one? Is that the one that's kind of this giant column that's in the center of that big rotary?
Yes, it's the obelisk right in the center of town. And the middle of town is called Monument Square, named after that monument. You can't miss it. So today we're going to talk about Concord and the Civil War. But of course, like everything else in Concord, we kind of have to start with April 19th, because it seems like everything in Concord happens on April 19th, which of course was the beginning of the American Revolution, 1775. The first men from Concord to go off to the Civil War was on April 19th, 1861. And then the monument in the center of town was dedicated on April 19th, 1867. So April 19th, as with most stories of Concord, is the underlying theme here for Concord and the Civil War.
Right.
So 450 men went off to the war from Concord, Massachusetts. 49 of them did not come back, either because they were killed in battle or, like many men in the Civil War, they died from disease. And there are 48 names currently on the Civil War monument in the center of town. There should be a 49th name, but we'll talk about that later. That's our teaser for the end of our talk. The monument was designed by Hammett Billings, and on the side it says they died for their country in the War of the Rebellion. And the corner of the monument, there rests underneath it a stone from the Old North Bridge, where the Battle of Concord happened in 1775. So they dedicated it on April 19th, 1867. And of course, the keynote address was given by, guess who? Ralph Waldo Emerson. Because it's the
most famous Concordian at the time,
right? 19th century. You can't do anything without Ralph Waldo Emerson being involved in the 19th century. And he gave the address at the dedication of the memorial. So, as I said, 450 men went off to the war. Today, I would like to talk about some of those men who went off to the war and did not come back.
Yeah, and before we get into that, can we talk about how were they volunteers? Was there a draft? And was that still during the time where you could sort of pay somebody else to go off in your place? Like, what were the circumstances around them enlisting?
Yes, yes, and yes to all of your questions. In 1861, they were all volunteers. After Fort Sumter was fired on April 12th, 1861, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers from all of the northern states. And so all of these men from Concord were volunteers in 1861. After 1863, that was the first draft by the federal government because they were running out of volunteers. And so they instituted a draft. And so some of the men from Concord were drafted. And yes, it was possible back then that if you had money, you could hire a replacement to go fight for you. And often you would pay somebody anywhere from $200 to $500 to go fight in your place, which led to some problems because some unscrupulous men would take the $200, they would join the army, and then as soon as they had a chance, they would desert, go to another regiment under an assumed name, and get the $200 that way. They were called bounty jumpers, and that's exactly what they were. We don't know if there were any bounty jumpers from Concord. We like to think that all of our men were patriotic and volunteered for all the right reasons, of course, to put down the rebellion.
Well, yeah, and because there was an anti-slavery movement in the northern states, and specifically in Concord, but I'm always unsure as to how many people that weren't really documented as being participants in something like the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. Like what was the feeling in town about what the cause was? Were they fighting against slavery, or was it, were they fighting for the Union, or?
There were some men from Concord who definitely joined the Union Army because they saw it as a war to end slavery. Almost from the very beginning, there were many Northerners who understood that the underlying cause of the war was indeed slavery. There were a great many men from the North who enlisted because they were patriotic and they wanted to preserve the Union. So it was a little bit of both. Some men enlisted for both reasons. They were patriots, they wanted to put down the rebels, and they wanted to end slavery. I think the rank and file, especially from Massachusetts, Massachusetts was definitely an anti-slavery abolitionist state. And so a lot of men from Massachusetts enlisted because they were abolitionists, and they thought that the war was going to be fought to end slavery. I think they knew that 2 years before Lincoln even knew that. And so a lot of men in Massachusetts, and we have some documented cases of men in Concord who definitely enlisted because they were abolitionists. Absolutely.
And what was the age range? Was there like an age limit?
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, the age of men enlisting was 18 to 40. But we also know that there were a lot of men in the Union Army who were over 40. And there are some very well documented cases, not in Concord, but elsewhere, of kids as young as 14, 15, and 16, even 12 years old enlisting. To enlist in the Union Army, the rules were not really that stringent. And the popular story is that you had to be over 18. And so there's stories of men kids putting the number 18 on a piece of paper and putting it in their shoe. And then when the doctor or the recruiting officer asked them if they were over 18, they would say, yes, I am over 18. And that happened, literally. That happened a lot. I think the youngest kid to fight in the Union Army, if I remember correctly, was 12. And there were drummer boys, of course. So drummer boys tended to be younger, under 18. But there were some rank and file men who fought carrying muskets who were definitely under the age of 18. So, and 40, 45. But by 50 or 60, I think most men were not going off to join the war. 50 years old was considered pretty old in 1861. Bronson Alcott was 61 years old, 62 years old when the Civil War began. He wasn't going to go off and join the war. Henry Thoreau was 43. He wasn't going to go off and join the war. Emerson was in his late 50s. He wasn't going to go off and fight. So it was definitely a young man's war. I think most men in the war were in their 20s and 30s.
Yeah. And can you describe the journey of, once they signed up, what happened? Like, where did they go? Were people allowed to go and stay with their friends, or were they sent off to different regiments, or how did that work?
So most of the men in Concord and most of the men from any town in the North and in the South would all be in the same company, which is why, and so 10 companies make up a regiment, and there tended to be about 100 men in each company. And so that's why you would have, in a horrific battle like Gettysburg or Antietam, where the casualty rates in some regiments could be 30, 40, even 50%, you would have whole populations of a town wiped out because it was friends and neighbors and relatives all joining together in 1861 and serving in the same regiment and the same company throughout the war. So you would be with your friends and your relatives and your brothers. And Concord has a really great example of brothers being in the same regiment. And of course, that's the Melvin brothers, who I'd like to talk about a little bit. So there were four brothers: Asa, John, Samuel, and James Melvin. They were all from Concord. And in 1861, the three older boys, Asa, John, and Samuel, enlisted in the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery. They're in the same company, Company K. They're in the same regiment. And it was one of the regiments that was in one of the forts outside of Washington, D.C. James was a little bit too young. He enlisted a couple of years later, but he was in a different regiment. But in the spring of 1864, when U.S. Grant was beginning the campaign against Robert E. Lee in Virginia, he needed more men. And so he took a lot of those men from the heavy artillery regiments in Washington, D.C. He put them into the infantry in the Army of the Potomac. And so for a group of men like the Melvins, who had heard or seen no fighting in the first 3 years of the war, are suddenly put into the infantry, and they're engaged in some of the bloodiest fighting of the Civil War. Starting in May of 1864, going all the way to the end of the war a year later. John Melvin did not make it. He actually died of disease before the campaign began. He died in a hospital in Virginia. Asa, the oldest, was killed during the siege of Petersburg. And then Samuel, the third son, was captured at the Battle of Spotsylvania in May of 1864 and sent to Andersonville, the notorious Southern prison in Georgia, where he died from malnutrition. So James survived the war. He was actually put in a regiment, not only in a fort, but was also protecting or guarding Confederate prisoners. So he never saw any fighting. So the three Melvin brothers are dead, killed in the war, or died of disease. Fast forward to 1897, late 1890s, James wants to put up a monument to his three deceased brothers, and one of his friends is a man named Daniel Chester French, the sculptor. Of course, the sculptor. And so the
one who would do the giant figure of Abraham Lincoln that sits in Washington.
And of course, the Minuteman statue over at the North Bridge in Concord,
right.
our Minuteman statue. So Daniel Chester French does this monument called Morning Victory, MOURNING, Morning Victory. And that monument is now in Sleepy Hollow. It was dedicated, I think, in 1909. And so that is we call it the Melvin Memorial, but the actual name of it is Morning Victory.
And it was just cleaned up last year and then rededicated. rededicated, I think, right?
It was grungy and dirty and crumbling a little bit. And the town of Concord spent a lot of money to restore it. It's absolutely beautiful. It looks brand spanking new. The Melvin's descendants came to Concord for the rededication. I was lucky enough to give them a private tour of Concord, and they were so much fun. And they were really into the history of not only their relatives, but the history of Concord as well. So to me,
I love it. I love it when families can come back to Concord and sort of see that there are, these plaques and these sculptures and memorials to, their ancestors that had, originated here. And there's
absolutely
something tangible for them to come back to.
And the Melvin Memorial is such a beautiful memorial over in Sleepy Hollow. And
describe it, because it's gorgeous, and it has benches, and it's
and so there's 3 brass plaques with names of Asa and Samuel and John, talking about where they died and their service. Victory herself has one arm raised up, and the other arm is holding a laurel wreath for victory. Absolutely gorgeous, marble and sandstone. It's absolutely beautiful. So,
it's sort of at the intersection of a few streets too. So if you're wandering around the cemetery, it's very hard to miss it.
Can't miss it. And for me, the Melvin brothers are a perfect microcosm of the Civil War itself, because here are 3 brothers who enlisted for patriotic reasons, and they all lost their lives in the war fighting for the Union.
And do we have like their letters or their journals or information from their families?
Sadly, Samuel actually had a diary that he was keeping, and he was keeping the diary while he was at Andersonville Prison, dying of malnutrition. And one of the last entries, he talks about how he would love to see home again, but he knows that his bones are going to end up in the soil of Georgia. And he wishes it was some other way. He wishes something else could happen so that he could go home. Absolutely heartbreaking reading the journal of Samuel Melvin. Absolutely.
So we have the journal, but we don't have his bones.
No, but we know where he's buried. We know where he's buried in Andersonville Prison. We know the plot number, and his grave is marked. So you could go down and see his grave in Andersonville if you wanted to. I did a few years ago. I was down in that area, and I went to Andersonville, and I found Samuel Melvin. Asa and John, we don't know where they're buried. So they're like hundreds, if not thousands of Union soldiers. They're somewhere, and they were buried somewhere, and we just don't know where.
And you're not talking about like a mass grave or something. You're just saying that when they had to clean up the battlefields, that they were just sort of
right. It could be a mass grave. It could be an individual grave. We just don't know. I mean, we know that they're still finding remains on some of the battlefields. A few years ago, they found the remains of a Union soldier, I think it was, or it might have been a Confederate soldier, either or.
Hard to tell now. Yeah.
Right. They found the remains of a soldier in an out of the way place on the Antietam battlefield. So they can still find people. They know there are a couple of mass graves on the Gettysburg battlefield. So we don't know where Asa and John ended up. So, but some of the men from Concord, we do know where they ended up because I visited some of their graves.
Well, and I just want to give you a personal, like a shout out, because I think you're very good at, all of these, like hunting down people that you've discovered and read about and finding and, posting, this is what their headstone looks like, to still keep them, as a memory, even on Facebook.
It's important for me to let these people know that they're not forgotten. Not just the famous folks that I visit all the time, but the not so famous folks. And a couple of years ago, when I was living down in Harper's Ferry and working in Gettysburg, I spent a lot of time wandering the Gettysburg and Antietam battlefields. I went to both national cemeteries in Gettysburg and Antietam, and it was actually relatively easy to find the graves of the Concord boys because I knew the regiments that they were in. And so one of the men that I found was John McDonough. He was in the famous 20th Massachusetts Infantry, known as the Harvard Regiment, because most of the officers had gone to Harvard. But John McDonough was not a Harvard graduate. He was actually born in Concord, the son of Irish immigrants, Brian and Nancy McDonough. He was listed in the 1860 Concord census as, quote, a laborer. And he enlisted in Company F of the 20th Massachusetts on August 26, 1861. He was killed at the Battle of Antietam on September 17th, 1862. He was 20 years old.
Wow.
And I visited his grave at the Antietam National Battlefield or National Cemetery a couple of years ago. Two other men that I visited their graves. There was a man named Barney Clark and another man named Francis Buttrick. They were both in the 32nd Massachusetts Infantry, and they both volunteered in 1861. Again, Barney Clark was a native of Ireland. By the 1840s, Massachusetts is home to many Irishmen and women, and a lot of the Irishmen enlisted to fight for their newly adopted country. So Barney Clark was Irish. He was listed as a farmer. And when he enlisted in 1862, he gave his age as 26. Barney Clark was wounded on July 2nd, 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg. He was, quote, shot through the body in the fighting around the wheat field in Gettysburg. He lasted 7 days with his horrific wound, and he died on July 9th, 1863, in one of the field hospitals in Gettysburg. And he was eventually buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery, which Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address there in November of 1863. So he was buried there, and Francis Buttrick also in the 32nd Massachusetts. He was 21 when he enlisted, and his occupation said that he was a farmer. And in fact, in the 1860 Concord census, he was 18 and was living with the Ralph Waldo Emerson family. Probably a gardener of some sort or a handyman. And he was also listed on the census before the 3 domestic female helpers that the Emersons had living in their house as well.
Wow. So it's actually likely that he met like the Concord authors and maybe, was running into Thoreau on
Absolutely.
A somewhat regular basis.
And you wonder what this farm kid who's working at the Emerson house as a gardener or as a domestic help of some sort, what he thought about some of these people like Thoreau and Bronson Alcott.
Yeah.
Who he would have.
Well, and also I wanted to say that your Francis Buttrick is not to be confused with the Francis Buttrick that I know from Waltham, who was alive at the same time and I think about the same age, but had a completely different life. He ended up, I think he started as a farmer and went into harvesting wood. And by the end of the century, he actually was able to donate funds enough to build the Waltham Public Library that's on Main Street. So Francis Buttrick is actually a very famous name in Waltham, but it's obviously two different people entirely.
Well, and for people who are listening to us and watching us who are not from Massachusetts, there are just Buttricks everywhere. there were and are a lot of Buttricks, and there continue to be a lot of Buttricks. So I'm not surprised that there are more than one guy named Francis Buttrick. So our Francis Buttrick, like Barney Clark, was wounded in the wheat field on July 2nd, 1863, at Gettysburg. His leg was amputated above the knee, and he was, quote, thought to be doing well, but because the weather was so excessively hot in Gettysburg that summer, gangrene set in, and he died on July 28, 1863. Now, while Barney Clark was buried in the National Cemetery in Concord, or in Gettysburg, Francis Buttrick was brought home, and he's buried in Sleepy Hollow.
Wow. So and to talk about the field hospitals for a minute, I know that we don't have, like we don't have to bring in all of the angst and the agony, but from the few reports that we have, even of like Louisa May Alcott and Walt Whitman, who went to help and, try to take care of people, that it was just, the conditions were absolutely appalling.
Yeah. Warfare in the Civil War had become modern. Medicine had not. And in some ways, a lot of American medicine was still pretty medieval. They believed in bleeding. They believed in purging. They believed in leeches, all of the above. There were, needless to say, there were a lot of advances in medicine because of the Civil War. But a lot of doctors, in fact, no doctors, understood anything about sepsis. They did not understand anything about germs. They did not understand anything about bacteria because that stuff hadn't been discovered yet. So it's no surprise.
Did they have any ether or anything to sort of put people under for operations?
They did. Ether or chloroform was used. In fact, I was just reading yesterday when I was looking some stuff up. 95% of Civil War operations were used either ether or chloroform during the operations. So it's not like, we think of guys biting on the bullet or things like that. It was horrific, yeah, but chloroform and ether was used. But sanitation was pretty horrible, at least in the field hospitals. Once they got to the bigger hospitals in either Washington, D.C. or Richmond or Chicago or any of the bigger cities, then the sanitation was better. They certainly understood that things should be clean, there should be fresh air, things like that. But they, in the field hospitals that were only sometimes a mile or two behind the fighting, it was pretty primitive, and they did what they could to help the men survive. Amputation being the number one thing that they did. If you were wounded in any of your extremities, chances of saving the limb were pretty nil, and so they would just amputate. Nowadays, amputations, the survival rate is incredibly high. Back then, because of disease like gangrene, the survival rate was not as good as it is today.
Yeah.
Cheerful.
Well, we're discussing war, so I think it's highly appropriate. And thank you for giving us all these details too, because it's actually like it's a little reassuring to me to know that they didn't have to literally bite the bullet all the time while things were being amputated, because I feel like I see a lot of movies or whatever, and they just want to overly dramatize things. So it's good to know that most of the operations were at least done when people were under or unconscious or something.
Yeah, shout out to one of my favorite museums in the world in Frederick, Maryland, is the Museum of Civil War Medicine. And it's pretty amazing, the things that they talk about, and not only the horrific nature of Civil War medicine, but also the advances that they made during the Civil War. One of my absolutely favorite museums. When I was living down there, I went there a few times. I went there a lot, actually, for lectures and stuff. But for me, to take men from Concord like Barney Clark and like John McDonough and Francis Buttrick, I mean, these are things that these guys from Concord went through. They saw some of the most absolutely horrific and experience some of the most horrific things a human being could experience.
Yeah.
And
At
so,
such a young age and so
right,
directly. Yeah.
21, 26 years old, to see that stuff. It meant a lot
And
to me.
when you're talking about advances, I feel like one of the most famous advances is embalming, because when and this is after the war, but when Lincoln died, they embalmed his body so that he could, ride the rails or whatever, and people could pay tribute.
Well,
And they wanted.
embalming became all the rage during the war. Actually, the Civil War helped the art of embalming incredibly. Most families tended to leave their loved ones, if they could find them, on the battlefield where they died. But a lot of men, like officers and higher ranking men, their bodies, if they could be recovered, tended to be sent home, which is why embalming became the forward thinking art that it became. And needless to say, there were a lot of people, embalmers, who followed the armies and worked for the armies, so that the bodies could be prepared to be sent home. Francis Buttrick was sent back to Concord, after he died at Gettysburg. So, we don't know, but perhaps his body was embalmed as well when he was sent back to Concord. So Barney Clark was left in Gettysburg, and was interned in the National Cemetery down there. And John McDonough, like I said, is at the Antietam National Battlefield. So, again, Concord is kind of the microcosm for me of what a lot of men were going through during the Civil War.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so do you want to talk about the 49th person that's supposed to be on that monument? I've been dying to find out about the thing that you're holding back.
So all the men that we've been talking about, the 48 men that are on the side of the monument in Monument Square, they were all white men. With the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, freeing the slaves in the southern states, Lincoln realized, thanks to people like Frederick Douglass, that a lot of these freed Black men could now become Union soldiers. And one of the men from Concord who became a soldier was George Washington Dugan. And he was a Black man from the town of Concord. And not only did he join a Black regiment, he joined the Black regiment. He joined the 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry, the famous Black regiment led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. And if you've seen the movie Glory, that's the regiment that the movie's about. It was not the first Black regiment, but it certainly is, in many people's minds, the most famous Black regiment. And it was the first one in the North that mustered and went to South Carolina. And we've got some information about Dugan. He was 44 years old when he enlisted in 1863, February 20th. He was 5'10". His complexion is listed as light. He had gray eyes and black hair, and his occupation is farmer, which is no surprise. Concord was a farming town.
But did he have his own farm, do you think, or was he just in that farming profession working for other farmers?
I think he had his own farm, if I remember correctly off the top of my head. He was a freedman, so he would have had his own farm, I think. He enlisted in Boston, and with the rest of the 54th, they did their training down in what is now Hyde Park, in Boston. The famous battle, their first big battle, was the Battle of Fort Wagner on July 18th, 1863. And that's where we lose touch with George Washington Dugan. He was listed as missing. In fact, on his military service record, it says he was a widower. and he's been missing since the assault on Fort Wagner on Morris Island, July 18th, 1863. So that's why he's not on the Civil War monument in Concord. He's the 49th man that died. We assume he died.
Yeah. By now, he's
definitely gone by now. But
yeah.
During the Civil War, you had three categories after a battle. You had killed, wounded, and missing. Missing could mean anything. Maybe the body was not identified.
Mm-hmm.
Not to be too gruesome, maybe the body was obliterated somehow.
Yeah. And none of the other 48 white men on the monument were ever listed as missing. They were listed as killed.
They were all listed as dead, yes, and or killed or died of disease. So, or maybe when you're missing, it was not unknown for men during the Civil War to just run away and get the hell out of there and desert. So
yeah. Well, and I've heard that there's a lot of controversy about the Black regiments, especially from the South, because there's documentation that, you could, if you were enslaved, that you could join a regiment and fight, quote unquote, for the South. But I've also heard that there was a lot of desertion. So if you were, it's complicated, right?
Yeah, well, the Black men that were fighting, quote unquote, for the South, they weren't doing it willingly, and they were not really fighting. They were not actually soldiers. They were the guys digging the trenches, digging the latrines, cooking the meals, working. They were teamsters driving the wagons and stuff like that. So one of the big myths that a lot of revisionist history likes to talk about is the myth of the Black Confederate soldier. There were no Black Confederate soldiers. There were black men who were servicing the Confederate soldiers and digging trenches and stuff like that. But as for the Union soldiers, the Black Union soldiers, that was the big question leading up to the formation of these regiments. Basically, white people were wondering, are these guys going to be able to fight? Are they as intelligent as white men? Can they handle battle like white men? Can they be brave like white men? Which, is absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. But even some of the white officers were a little concerned because Black men could not be officers. They were white officers. Black men could be sergeants and corporals. They could be NCOs, non-commissioned officers. But the actual colonels and lieutenant colonels, captains, lieutenants, they were all white. And
did they also come from money? Like, was it hard for a poor, unknown soldier to work his way up the ranks, or was that?
It could be done. It could be done. But even in the white regiments, most of the officers tended to be men of means. Like Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, a perfect example of the 54th Massachusetts. He came from a really wealthy Boston family who were abolitionists. And so most officers in white or Black regiments tended to be men of standing from your neighborhood or your town or your community. So back to Dugan, he's missing. We are now assuming that he was killed during the Battle of Fort Wagner in July of 1863. There were a lot of men whose bodies were not identified after the battle, which the Confederates won. Robert Gould Shaw and his men were all buried in a large grave, a large mass grave. So I'm thinking probably Dugan was one of those men. Unfortunately, over the years, it's right on the coast of South Carolina, and the ocean basically has taken over that part of what was Fort Wagner. So most of those men would have been washed out to sea a long, long time ago. So that's where we stand now. Should Dugan be on the monument because we don't know if he died in the war? Well, yeah, most historians, including myself, the wonderful Concord historian Rick Fries, who's done a lot of work on Concord during the Civil War, we're pretty convinced that Dugan died during the Battle of Fort Wagner. And so because of that, there are people in Concord who are trying to get Dugan's name put onto the Civil War monument. The marker or the plaque that's on there now with the 48 names, it's been replaced 2 times already because names have been added. So it is not uncommon or strange to have the plaque replaced on the Civil War monument. So it would be very easy, I think, to put Dugan's name on there and put a new plaque up on the Civil War monument. The 5th graders of Willard School in Concord a couple of years ago, they wrote a letter to the selectmen of Concord saying they should put Dugan's name on the plaque. But that's kind of where it stands right now. COVID, unfortunately, has kind of shut down all those ideas. But I like to think in the near future, if we keep being annoying enough to the selectmen, maybe they'll just finally say, fine, we'll put him up there just to shut all these people up. But I would love
so if you're watching, you don't have to actually be annoying. You could actually just be polite and say, hey, I know of this great story from history, and this man deserves his due.
Well, I hope the selectmen are aware of George Washington Dugan's name by now. They have to
exactly.
be. So,
exactly.
So those are just some of our stories. We have so many other stories of people from Concord: Ezra Ripley, George Prescott. The names just go on and on of people from Concord who fought in the Civil War. Maybe that'll be a part 2 sometime. But these are some of the people that I've researched.
I would love that. And also I wanted to just sort of talk about Rick Fries' book for a minute, because this sort of has the beginnings of some of these stories that we're talking about. And if stuff is still being uncovered and we're still trying to figure out all of the connections.
I have it too.
It's not that long, but it's a really beautiful and well documented read. So
and we know a lot of these stories because of Rick Fries. He's kind of the one who started this ball rolling a few years ago. Not only Concord history, but Civil War history has always been near and dear to my heart. So the fact that I get to combine both of them, I think is pretty cool. So, but yeah, we have a lot more we can talk about, but we should probably end it there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for staying with us and for listening to all of these stories of Concord in our show, Concord Days. We'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Goodbye.